On behalf of Grace Episcopal Church, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. It's a memorable event in the life of our church, and also a very memorable event for the life of downtown Hopkinsville. So thank you all for coming.
And in the 1880s, Grace Episcopal Church had to make a decision whether it was going to stay in downtown Hopkinsville or not. And a committee was formed with Ed Johnstone, chairman of the committee. Joe Vance was senior warden, Charlie Wade was junior warden, and John Kirkham acted as their attorney. And after much discussion, the church voted to stay in downtown Hopkinsville and committed its first capital campaign in over 100 years and built All Saints Parish Hall, which is the far left, you can't see for the trees now, and the Grace Church Kindergarten building in 1884, and it was dedicated. And we had the same discussion 6 years ago when we started these projects. And it doesn't happen overnight. We're very proud that this green space has been developed. This was the last property that we acquired. And after All Saints was built, we acquired 5 pieces of property on Virginia Street, which were of reputable, not reputable, well, I'm not going to say any more about those buildings. We've acquired 4 pieces of property since then, and these 2 pieces right here were our last acquisition. And we're very, very happy that the park is here. The brochure that Taylor Hayes prepared is magnificent. It talks a lot about the Labyrinth itself and the history of this site. And so I encourage you all to read it. I also encourage everyone in Hopkinsville to walk the Labyrinth. This is not just Grace Church's Labyrinth. It's been built for the entire city. And we're proud to offer it to the city and encourage everyone to walk it today and any day you want to.
Thank you, Edwin, and thank everyone for coming out on this gorgeous evening. It's a joy to have everybody here in part of the heart of Hopkinsville. Grace Commons, we hope, will be a place that you will come to and return to again and again. And what we think will bring you here is not just the beauty, but also the Labyrinth, which is its spiritual center and its spiritual heart. The Labyrinth is a sacred path that's been installed here, and it's really dedicated to the entire community. It's a sacred center, and we invite you to come here and enjoy it at any time. Labyrinths are interesting places to come and reflect and to pray. And you enter the Labyrinth in only one place, and the entrance is right in front of me. You'll see as you walk around the outside, there's a clear mark that enters where we go in. A labyrinth is not a maze. There are no cutoffs. There are no dead ends. A labyrinth has one way into the center, and when you arrive in the center, you stay there for whatever period of time you'd like, and then you turn back around and walk your way back out to the exit. People walk labyrinths for a variety of reasons. Some people do it just because it calms them or centers them or focuses them as a means of relaxation. And other people do it as a spiritual discipline. They approach the labyrinth with a question in mind or a prayer in their heart. And they ask that as they walk the labyrinth, they ask God to give them some response to their question, to their prayer, to what's on their heart or what's on their mind. And as we walk the labyrinth and as we arrive at the center, we can stand and pray and reflect for a period of time. And sometimes answers to life's questions come to us when we focus ourselves and center ourselves in this way. It's a way to sort of let some of the noise of our lives die down so that we can focus on the important questions that we're called to ask. I hope that you'll come here and use this labyrinth many times, and that you too will find it to be a place of spiritual insight and closeness to God. Thank you so much for being here today, and I hope to see you again here many days in the future.
I've seen labyrinths in other, in different environments, but you see a lot of them involved with churches or Christian organizations. Maybe can you explain a little bit about why that is?
Sure. How they got there originally is kind of an interesting story, and then I'll elaborate more. When the monks were transcribing religious texts before the printing press, they had to be very specific and very faithful to what was on the page that they were rewriting. And so they couldn't really show their skill, they just rewrote what existed. But they also had a desire to show their penmanship with a quill. So in the margins, they were allowed the freedom to doodle, and the doodles turned into labyrinths because they were very complicated. You had to be very skilled with your feather in order to create one. And as those religious texts transferred around the globe and were passed on from church to church, what was written on the page and the labyrinths on the margins became sort of synonymous. And then as the great cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals of Europe were built approximately 800 to 1,000 years ago, it was a natural fit for the labyrinths then to be put into the cathedrals as they were being built. So I think that answers the question.
All right, are there different types of labyrinths, and what kind of labyrinth, and if there is, what type of labyrinth is being built here at Grace Episcopal Church in Hopkinsville, Kentucky?
There are literally hundreds of styles of labyrinths. All a labyrinth really is a singular path that leads to the center. What we should talk about, though, is the fact that in the approximate 4,000 years of labyrinth history with human beings, being a part of human spirituality, for the first 4,000 years there was one pattern that somehow transferred almost completely around the globe. 27 different countries dating back to at least 600 BC had the same pattern. But then about 1,000 years ago, when the Gothic cathedral construction started, then it really opened up, and the mathematicians in the cathedrals, which was the school of higher learning then, really took the labyrinth to a new level. The Greeks, the Romans, the great Gothic cathedral time, they all took it to another level and expanded on how many circuits and the ornamentations that are on it. You have a Chartres labyrinth, which comes from the nave of the cathedral in Chartres, France. It's just a little over 800 years old. It's by far our most requested labyrinth, and I feel the reason why is because it's the most beautiful and the most ornate and contains what is referred to as sacred geometry, which seems to have a pretty profound effect on people and their overall sense of well-being.
You've mentioned now a couple of times, you've used the word math, you've used the word geometry, and during our time over the last couple of weeks, you've talked to me a lot about all the aspects that are of math that are brought into this. Maybe, and I know you could talk forever on the different elements that math is used in this labyrinth. Can you sort of tell us in layman's terms, so to speak, a little bit about the math that's used in building the Chartres labyrinth?
Sure. First off, I should explain, I don't think I was bright enough to design this labyrinth in the first place. It takes all my mental capacity just to unravel it and understand it. I guess the best way I could explain it is that there are no random numbers. Everything relates to something else. For example, if there's these rings in the center that you may be able to video later, a pathway, or one of the circuits as they're called, is a third of one of those rings. One of those rings is indeed a third of the center. The center is a quarter of the overall diameter. So everything relates to everything else. There's no random numbers, and there's a few puzzles in geometry that have hidden solutions that make it quite nice. And it's thought that there are 279 stones in a pathway that leads to the center. And if you look in the Bible, you'll see that 279 days goes by from the announcement to the birth of Jesus, which is indeed the human gestation period, which is a pretty phenomenal thing to think that these guys were so thoughtful that in their attempt to possibly represent Mary, they thought to put 279 stones in the pathway to create the length of the path, all random lengths of stones, but yet all kinds of symbolism that can be unraveled at a later date if you're inquisitive enough to look at it.
You were talking about here recently a colleague of yours who also develops labyrinths were trying to figure out if there was some significance to the circumference or to the diameter, I guess. And you might say what the diameter is, give some of the numbers involved, but also what you all think that might relate to.
All right, well, as I said, there's this relationship of path to the circle, circle to the center, center to the overall diameter, but for several years we couldn't figure out what the overall diameter meant. It was 42 feet 3 3/8 inches, which is a pretty obscure number. but a great friend and wonderful mathematician and labyrinth builder from St. Louis, Robert Ferre, called me up in excitement one day, and he believed he had discovered it. What he found was that if you turn it into a decimal, the 42 foot 3 3/8, turn it into a decimal and multiply it by 1 million, it's exactly the diameter of our globe, which translates into the labyrinth in the nave of the cathedral in Chartres, France, or thus the one here, because we've created a replica of the one faithfully, that it is exactly 1 millionth the diameter of our globe, which is pretty phenomenal coincidence, I guess you would call it, based on the knowledge that the labyrinth is a little over 800 years old.
To an individual that travels into the labyrinth, what's the total linear feet that someone travels following the path from the start to the center?
It's about 850 feet on a true replica. We create other sizes, larger and smaller on the need, but the one that's here in Hopkinsville is, like I said, a replica of the original, and it's about 850 feet, and of course 3 football fields is 900 feet, so it's real close to walking 3 football fields just to get to the center. And then again, if you trace your steps back out, it's another nearly 3 football fields back out. So it's a good long walk, all wound inside of that 42-foot diameter that we talked about.
Let's talk a little bit about this particular labyrinth. I mean, to someone passing by, it might look just like somebody has put in a patio of sorts using paver stones. You know, I know, and others know that there's a lot more work and detail that's gone into this. Let's talk about what the labyrinth's made of and the work that you've done prior to arriving on site, as well as what you've done on site.
All right. Prior to leaving to come to Hopkinsville, George and I spent about half of the time. By the way, George has been employee and partner, friend for about 25 years, so he's a good and skilled guy, and I don't know what I would do without him, and has made literally every labyrinth with me so far. I forgot the question.
Let's just talk a little bit about this labyrinth. You know, first of all, what's it made of?
Okay, so before we left home, what we did was we spent approximately half the time, and when you talk about time, it takes 1,000 hours, and if you look at a regular 40-hour work week, that's half of 1 year for one man. But George and I are able to condense that down to, less than 6 months, because the one thing, we tend to work 10, 11-hour days. We work 7 days a week when we're working on a labyrinth. So we're getting almost 2 weeks every day, or every week, times 2 of us, so we can condense that down to a reasonable time frame, but it is brutal physical on us to work that amount of hours. So half that 1,000 hours was spent prior to leaving to come to Hopkinsville. The other half is spent here, and most of the time prior spent cutting pavers, shaping some of the detailed pieces that are the teeth around the outside called lunations, the rosette center with its exact detail. All those were created before leaving home. Upon arrival, of course, we have to receive those pavers that we've shipped to ourselves. We've created a base underneath of compressed limestone that literally 100 tons of gravel. We really don't want it to move. We don't want it to sink and settle. We like to think that we're creating historic landmarks for the future. We would like to think that, as in Chartres, people like myself, 800 years later, coming back to see those labyrinths and unravel their secrets, we'd like to think that ours would be here that long. So we go to an extreme. We put 100 tons of gravel in, and we also bring what we consider to be the best manufacturer of pavers, Payblock Industries in Marengo, Illinois. We bring their pavers with us to use them because we find them to be the best in the nation. You can't create history if you're not using the best products. After arrival, then, George and I create the base and then go to the laborious task of placing all the pavers and then doing all the finite detail, putting in the U-turns, keeping it consistently round. Speaking of round, we're plus or minus a 1/16 of an inch on the radius, which is pretty incredible considering it's pavers and how many multiples of joints there are and chances for error. We're pretty pleased with this one. It's real round and it's very detailed, and it's crowned in the center for good water drainage, so we believe the labyrinths that we make will be here until you remove them.
Yeah, I know the Grace Episcopal Church is excited about this particular opportunity to open up to the community with this, I guess what we call a labyrinth here in the community. community, and we certainly hope that it's going to be around for many, many generations
Sure that it will.
to come. So you've basically got about 1,000, between you and George, you all have about 1,000 hours involved in putting this labyrinth together, shaping stones, and I might add, hand-shaping stones.
Absolutely. We use no laser beams, no computers, no anything. We're just a one step below Egyptian.
Let me ask you this. From a perspective of why do you see churches wanting to put in labyrinths? You know, what's the excitement about a Christian organization wanting to put in a labyrinth, and what can it mean for a church organization? And then I also I'll come back and ask, you know, what does something like this mean for the community? Because this is going to be open to the community here in Hopkinsville. But let's talk first about the church organization. What can something like this, how can that benefit a church?
That's so many different ways you could go with the answer that we could go on and on about this. To the church directly, I would say it offers another place to pray. Lauren Arcturus from San Francisco calls it a watering hole for your soul, or purposeful pacing, which I think are good ways to describe it. Maybe to tell you a story. Mamie Huffman in Shreveport, Louisiana was being hounded by an interviewer who was probably trying to get her to say something that he could take out of context. And when she realized what he was doing, she said, "Listen here, young man, when I get to the center of that labyrinth, that's my phone booth to God. Put that in your newspaper." I think that kind of sums up what it can do for a church. But in addition to that, it can be used for celebrations, change of the season, you know, spring equinox, summer solstice, things like that. Christmas celebrations, birthdays, any type of celebration, any kind of more spiritual need, prayers, I mean, funerals, walking with deceased loved ones. I mean, there's so many different ways that a labyrinth can be used. My own children love to use them in their own birthday parties, so much so that their friends would come to our house to use our labyrinth during their birthday parties. So it's truly the beautiful thing about a labyrinth is there's no rule book at the door telling you how you should or should not use it. It's open to all persuasions. The same Mamie Huffman called me on the phone and said she was ecstatic because the Jewish community in Shreveport had called and asked if they could come over to the Methodist church and walk their labyrinth. And she was just beside herself with happiness because it was a community space that they wanted used by everyone, open to all. And I think that's a good portion of the reason that they're having such a resurgence in human spirituality right now, is because we all need to learn how to walk in someone else's footsteps and look at the world from someone else's perspective rather than telling them how they must feel, think, and do. And a labyrinth affords the opportunity to come and be spiritual in the way that you feel fit benefits you the most.
You've talked a little bit about the spiritual angle, and even from a community perspective, that can be looked at from a spiritual angle, but you've built a lot of labyrinths for communities that
Parks,
are
hospitals,
in public
universities.
spaces and so forth. What would a labyrinth mean for a community? I mean, in generally speaking, what can a labyrinth do for a community, and why have some of these municipalities and public organizations actually had labyrinths built on their properties?
I think the best, I mean, I could go on and on with a list, but I think the way to sum it up would be that at the office, Debbie, my wife and partner in this, she receives literally weekly some type of an email or letter from someone somewhere in our nation where we have put a labyrinth, who's walked the labyrinth and had an experience. Maybe mom just went home and was more patient with her children after a calming walk. Maybe it was a real eye-opener, like I'm too impatient and I need to get to the center too quickly and don't have time. Or sometimes it's as eye-opening as the autistic boy who spoke for the first time in class with his classmates when he got to the center of the labyrinth. I mean, bordering on miracles. You know, and I'm not professing miracles happen on labyrinths, it's the intent of the user, but the benefits of sharing a space, a vessel for containment. I mean, in New Orleans, they walked the labyrinth on Easter morning to symbolize the resurrection of New Orleans. In Knoxville, there was a crowd of 1,000 people that gathered around the Labyrinth on 9/11 because they didn't know where else to go from downtown. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of things that a Labyrinth can be used for. Jeff Sayward, an author and Labyrinth historian from England, wrote that in times of great distress and uncertainty, labyrinths moved to the forefront. And if you look at a timeline of labyrinth enthusiasm during the Greeks, the Romans, the different periods where we know that labyrinths became pretty popular in general society, where there's a great cluster of them, historic ones, there's always a great uncertainty that happens at that time. So then the question would be, what is our uncertainty today? And we have so many different things that we're uncertain about at this time. It seems like the perfect time for another resurgence of labyrinth enthusiasm, and sure enough, here it is. And I believe if you were to look at history, this is probably the greatest single revival of labyrinth enthusiasm in human spirit, and it's been going on for a little over 4,000 years, and globally too. I mean, there's been labyrinths dating back 600 BC that in Arctic Russia, in Sumatra, Arizona, North Africa, all around the Mediterranean. I mean, it's not specific to a race or a culture. It's global. And the even more bizarre fact about that is for the first 4,000 years, all of them places had the same labyrinth. How did it get there? It's just an incredible thing. And that's why there's so much labyrinth enthusiasm. You can be a labyrinth enthusiast from the mathematical standpoint, the spiritual standpoint, the historic standpoint, construction standpoint. There's so many different ways that the labyrinth can bring you in and make you a fan or someone who appreciates labyrinth.
1, 2, 3.